The Green Bay Packers' incoming president may not be a football guy, but his arrival could signal a significant shift in how the football team actually works. Jason Hirschhorn, America's guest and my co-founder at The Leap, joins me to explain.
You are Locked On Packers, your daily Green Bay Packers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Packers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Peter Bukowski, and I cover the Packers for The Leap, a newsletter I would love for you to subscribe to. Follow me on Twitter, Peter_Bukowski. Follow the podcast on Twitter, Locked On Packers. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you find podcasts, you will find Locked On Packers, the number one Packers podcast on the internet. And the show for fans who know what happened, they want to know why and how. Thanks to everyone who makes Locked On Packers their first listen every day. We hope you like starting your day with us as much as we like starting our day with you. Today's episode brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Jason Hirschhorn on the show today to talk about the Packers' new president. And I didn't spend a lot of time on it because I was just like, well, this is in the future. There's not a lot to say from a football standpoint. But Jason, in a great piece that he wrote from The Leap, reminded me that that's not true. That there are real football implications, potentially, not just football, but structural personnel. Like there are meaningful potential implications to a new president, a transfer of power away from Mark Murphy to a new president who is not a quote unquote football guy. Let's get into it with Jason. Joining me now from The Leap, a newsletter we would love for you to subscribe to, America's guest, Jason Hirschhorn, to talk about ed policy. I guess we should call you Jason Interviewee on the show today because it does sound like a made-up name. It's not. And you wrote a great piece for The Leap, a newsletter we would love for you to subscribe to, about what might be changing. And I thought this would be a particularly interesting topic because Andrew Brandt said the other day, this is not a football guy. And so it still could have real football implications for the Green Bay Packers. Can you take us back to when Mark Murphy changed the structure of this team, or maybe even to Bob Harlan before that, to set the stage here?
We really do have to talk about all of that because there are people out there, and I don't just mean fans, there are people in the media covering the Packers who act as though any conversation about the Packers structure, their org chart, is ultimately irrelevant because the last time it changed, nothing extremely bad happened immediately. And while that is true, there was not some terrible thing that happened immediately following or in the years right after that change. It's a little bit of doublespeak because we have two different presidents. Bob Harlan, who took over in the late 80s, made the big changes in the early 90s, and later Mark Murphy in 2018, who made changes as power structure because they felt it necessary. So you can't say these things don't matter if you're saying that these presidents in general do, because they felt as though this was something that was necessary. Now, Harlan took what had been the Packers model for much of the 70s and the 80s, obviously a time when they were not very successful, and basically cut out what was then, the executive committee of the board of directors from having influence on football decisions. What he did was set up a linear hierarchy with the GM right below him, the team president, and then everyone else below that. So the head coach, other people in football operations, all operating below the general manager, giving the general manager final say on basically any major football decision. This was the model that was followed for basically the rest of the time that the Packers had Brett Favre and later Aaron Rodgers. There was a period of time where Mike Sherman held both the head coach and GM title, but still the linear power structure was the same. Murphy changed that again in 2018. This is when Ted Thompson is reassigned out of the GM chair. Brian Gutekunst is brought in as the GM. He was already part of the organization, but he was promoted into that role.
Right.
And this is when the big change happened. Murphy puts himself, already at the top, but he is now the direct report for not just the general manager. He's direct report now for the head coach. He's direct report for the director of football operations. Now, those people are at this point Mike McCarthy, Brian Gutekunst, and Russ Ball. All of those figures are now on an even playing field, which means that in theory, if one of them disagrees with the other on a decision, they have the same line of communication to Mark Murphy to make any argument they want to about whatever that matter is. Now, that ultimately didn't happen too often. Like there's a little bit of it as it pertains to Aaron Rodgers. There was stuff that Tom Silverstein covered early in LaFleur's tenure about some of the coaching hires, and that was more salary-based, but still ended up affecting what happened with the coaching staff. So you can't say that
a little bit of axe grinding in there too.
Oh, for sure. It's covered in the story that I would love for you to check out. But ultimately, these things didn't lead to any huge disputes. And that's why you'll see a lot of people say these sort of things don't matter. But Mark Murphy is a football guy, by which I mean he was a former player, an all-pro, by the way. We're not talking about like a run-of-the-mill player, like right. Super Bowl champion as a player. He then, for a while, was with the NFLPA. Then he goes into college, works as an athletic director at his alma mater, Colgate, then moves to Northwestern, where he, among other things, runs a head coaching search that results in Pat Fitzgerald being hired. I mean, stuff happened much later with Pat Fitzgerald. The point being is he had run coaching searches prior to the time when he remodeled the Packers organization, put himself at the top. I mean, put himself at the top of football operations, and then ultimately was the final say on who they hired to replace Mike McCarthy in 2019. Now, these things are just not applicable, at least not one-to-one, with Ed Policy. He is certainly someone who you can say is qualified for this position. So that's not what anyone here is saying. However, he just doesn't have the same kind of football background. So I'm sure we'll get into this, but sometimes when there's going to be these big decisions that directly pertain to football operations, if Ed Policy maintains the same power structure, it could get, maybe not squirrely, but it could get a little bit combative.
And so let's go to 2018, because I think this is instructive. When Mark Murphy made the change, he said he was breaking down silos. To me, and I think to you, he was creating new silos. It was there before. Yes. There was just one silo. Now there's three, because you have three guys who can all, theoretically, if they need to, go behind the other's back and tattle to daddy, who in this case is Mark Murphy, which is not unlike some NFL structures where you have an owner and you have, like in San Francisco, a head coach with final roster say, or in Seattle for a long time with Pete Carroll and John Schneider. But now you have this situation. What is the concern? What are the potential problems that you wouldn't have if, let's say, the GM can hire and fire all the ops people, all the head coaches, all those things?
Well, you laid out some of it, right? Like, because the Packers essentially had aligned vision on what they wanted to be at all levels. They had Aaron Rodgers, who had been a multi-time MVP, ended up winning multiple MVPs after that decision. It's really easy to get everybody behind the idea, let's build around Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah.
And in a way, the Packers look like they're going to have something somewhat similar with Jordan Love. He's not been extended at the time of this recording. That's something that feels like a fait accompli. So in that way, it's not as big of a deal either immediately, because everybody wants to get behind Jordan Love. But as I wrote in the article, the NFL rarely unfolds as expected. There is likely to come a point down the line when maybe the head coach wants to do plan A, maybe the general manager wants to do plan B, and maybe Russ Ball doesn't agree with either one of those. And at that point, if you're Ed Policy, you have to manage all of that. Whereas under the old model, the GM's decision was the final one. So it doesn't necessarily matter that it's the GM versus the head coach versus whatever. It's that there was linear power before, and now it's more diffuse. And the other thing I'd point out here is Ed Policy, by president standards, is fairly young. He's in his early 50s. The last two presidents left when they reached the mandatory retirement age. If Ed Policy follows that path, he's someone who stays in this position until he turns 70. Just realistically, he's going to have to run a GM and or head coaching search, both in all likelihood. And, that's something he might be very equipped for, but we don't know that because he doesn't have that same football operations background. And that's why maybe it makes more sense for him, and we'll find out when he speaks with the media whether he plans to do this, to move to maybe the model they had before under Bob Harlan and early on under Mark Murphy, maybe something slightly different, but in either case, something with a linear power structure, because it takes some of those questions out of the equation.
We'll be back with more with Jason in just a second here on Locked On Packers. Today's episode brought to you by our friends at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has changed everything and allowed you to maintain your vehicle, to level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Back with Jason in just a second, but are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So if I'm trying to be as diplomatic to Mark Murphy, as sympathetic to his cause as I can be, you look at 2018 and you go, okay, first-time GM, they end up hiring a first-time head coach. And you would say, okay, I have this football background. It makes sense for me to be the hand that guides this. I can understand that. But then the question becomes, and he has said at some point, or is at least intimated, at some point he'd change it back if he felt like that was the best thing to do. It seems reasonable that that would happen if and when either or both of the GM and head coach prove to be capable and they no longer need their hands held, which I suppose you could reasonably argue would potentially be the case in 2018. It seems like we're there, Jason. Like, isn't now the perfect time? And maybe this is the signal that, hey, this is the moment to move this back.
That would certainly make sense. And in fairness to Mark Murphy, the concerns about, the head coach and the GM trying to go behind each other's backs, he managed that very well. We do know that, and by the way, that happened with Mike McCarthy. He did not always agree with Ted Thompson. And so, like, if there would have been times, had that been the power structure, that he probably would have gone to the president and said, hey, man, like, we got to do something. Like, this is not working out. Yeah. And if you remember in 2021 and in 2022, those off seasons, there was some disagreement about what the Packers should do as it pertains to Aaron Rodgers. Matt LaFleur, we know from reporting, in those off seasons was, let's keep Rodgers. I don't think we have a real viable alternative right now. Brian Gutekunst wasn't like, get rid of Rodgers right now, but he was a little less sure about that because they'd already drafted Jordan Love. That was obviously his big selection.
Yeah.
At some point they were going to transition. 2023, those opinions changed somewhat given that Love had more time, and we know what happened with Rodgers. The point being is those issues ended up being managed effectively by Mark Murphy. Now, Ed Policy in the same position might have done just as strong of a job, but we don't know that right now. Ed Policy doesn't even know that right now. So when the time comes, when he takes over in 2025, you keep in mind, Mark Murphy is still going to be the team president throughout the 2024 season. At that point, when they finally have the transition of power, it may be the perfect opportunity to reorganize the organization, whether that's to what they had before, to something different that really plays to whatever Ed Policy's strengths and weaknesses are. Because in some ways, it's a strength to him that he's not Mark Murphy. He probably isn't going to say some of the things to the public that Mark Murphy did on a number of occasions. Yeah. However, it's also true that he just doesn't have the same
poker player in the NFL, Mark Murphy.
Absolutely the worst. His foot is still in his mouth as we speak. But it is also true that Mark Murphy has handled a lot of football things that Ed Policy never has. He's been the commissioner of the Arena Football League, but as I put in the article, he actually only oversaw the league for a single game of operation because then they went into bankruptcy, not because of him. That just happened to be the time he took over. But the point is, he just doesn't have that part of the job on his resume. And he doesn't have to. He can be a highly effective team president without being directly involved in football operations the way that Murphy has been the last half decade or so. But again, that's a decision that he is going to have to make. And he's going to have to make it officially sometime within about the next year. So I think it's imperative to talk about this because, there may be nothing that comes of this long term, right? They may keep the structure, they may change it, and either way it might be fine. But it's not about knowing that it will be fine or knowing that it won't. It's about understanding that there is a real chance that these things could go awry if not properly managed. So I don't think it's a problem with the promotion of Ed Policy. As I wrote in the article, based on my conversations with people in the league, everybody kind of knew it was going to be him replacing Mark Murphy. He'd been in the organization for over a decade. They were grooming him for the role, and not just because of the titles that he had. Like, he had responsibilities outside the strict definition of his job. That's the kind of thing you do with someone you plan to take over as the team president. When you consider that position is effectively a de facto owner, all of that makes sense, right? Like, there are qualified people across the league, but they don't have the institutional knowledge that someone who's been in the organization for, I think it's 12 years. They just don't have that necessarily. So I think that the decision on paper makes sense, but that doesn't mean it's not worth discussing whether the organization should change a little bit once he takes over.
Yeah, and I think I'll take it a step further. I think it makes sense for Mark Murphy to announce that ahead of time, whether it's the day before he retires or now or whatever, and don't make Ed Policy do it where it seems like he's having to undo something. I think just from Mark Murphy's standpoint, I think that makes sense. And for the good of the organization, I think that makes sense to do it that way. I don't think ultimately it matters that much. I do wonder, Jason, if trying to go back, if there is a little bit of genie out of the bottle here, because now Matt LaFleur as a head coach has only known I have the ear of the president and I don't report to that guy, Brian Gutekunst. If you change that, I mean, look, these are people with egos, and if you change the structure here, that could potentially throw what has been working into a little bit of flux, right?
Yeah, there is some risk there too, and I think you laid it out very well. But it is also the case that if you don't do that and suddenly there's a new president, well, now everybody involved might want to push the other ones out of the way in terms of having final
scramble up the ladder.
Yeah, so there's risk in either direction, but we know that the Packers, and not even just Green Bay, we should extend it beyond this. When they first made this change in 2018 under Mark Murphy, I pointed out at the time in my writing that there were a few other teams over the previous 20 or so years that had tried that model with basically no success. Like the Miami Dolphins, when Joe Philbin in particular was there, he was on the same playing field as the general manager, and it did not go well. And it's not because Joe Philbin is someone who's difficult to work with, right? We all know that Joe Philbin is one of the most, genteel individuals working in the NFL. However, it's just the reality that when you have too many cooks in the kitchen, things can become difficult. And it's a lot easier when you know who has final say on difficult decisions. LaFleur and Gutekunst appear to have a very strong working relationship. I think they could manage it if one or the other got final say. I think that's still an interesting question, right? Because Matt LaFleur has this nearly spotless first 5 years as the head coach. And Brian Gutekunst appears to have just landed the third consecutive long-term franchise quarterback for the Packers. So either one can make an argument.
2 of the last 3 draft classes. We'll see about this one, but is on a draft heater right now.
Yeah, so they're both really well positioned to make the argument that they should be atop the food chain, but we have seen that most teams have success, or the teams that have the most success tend to have the GM at the top and the head coach directly underneath them, because head coaches, for the most part, are trying to will look to make short-term decisions because they care about tomorrow. General managers care about the days after that. So given that the Packers had success with the GM at the top of football operations, given that LaFleur and Gutekunst appear to have a very strong working relationship, I think they could manage that fairly well. It's not as though we have evidence that Brian Gutekunst is going to disregard LaFleur's opinions if he is made officially a subordinate to him on the organizational chart. I'm not as worried about that if I'm the Packers. as I am if they leave it the same and suddenly Ed Policy, who, again, we have every reason to think is capable of handling most of what this job entails, suddenly has to make football decisions in a way he never has had to do in any previous post he's had with the Packers or anywhere else.
All right, we'll finish up with our pal Jason Hirschhorn in just a second on Locked On Packers. Summertime means baseball. It means the NBA draft. More to come tonight. You had the opportunity at the NBA Finals, Stanley Cup Final. Football's right around the corner. You can bet on all of it at FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 that you can use to bet on everything from who's going to hit a home run or who is going to win the whole thing in Major League Baseball. The Dodgers are still the favorites. I kind of like the Guardians. Guardians are 22-1 right now. That seems a little long. I have the Phillies, I think, in the mid to late teens. I might even have them in the 20s to 1. Really liking that right now. They're like mid single digits right now to win it all. And I'm liking my chances. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to add a big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. To Jason in a second, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. So I think I have two more questions here as it relates to all of this. The first is, Brian Gutekunst, what evidence do we have? And I don't ask this rhetorically, although I have some idea of how I would answer it. But what evidence do we have that Brian Gutekunst, if given the final say, is capable and the best person, let's say, in the organization to do that versus other teams where maybe the coach has much more input into, these final decisions?
Well, I think we actually do have some evidence that he's not like a power-hungry maniac in the way that certain individuals in the NFL have been.
Yeah.
If you remember, when the Packers offered him the GM job, he was basically in Houston already to interview for that GM position. They said, hey, don't take the interview. Come back to Green Bay. The job is yours. And then after he formally accepted it, they told him, by the way, new organizational structure, you don't have final say on who your head coach is going to be. And if you even get to fire Mike McCarthy. If you remember, the decision to fire Mike McCarthy was Mark Murphy's, not Brian Gutekunst. So given that Gutekunst was put in actually pretty uncomfortable situations as it pertains to that, like, you don't want to accept a job and then find out that the terms of the agreement are not what you were told, but he managed it and handled it extremely professionally. So if things change where he is put at the top of football operations, I don't think it's going to become the case, or I think it's less likely to become the case, where he's suddenly a tyrant there and forcing all of the other major leadership members to just do things they do not think work. So I do think it makes sense for Gutekunst to keep in mind also he's been with the organization since the 90s, so he saw how Ron Wolf did it.
Yeah, Ron Wolf hired him.
Yeah, he saw how Ted Thompson did it. So given that he has all of that knowledge, all the institutional knowledge about how those things worked and how to manage that organization that way, I think he has as good of a shot as any to manage it going forward, if indeed they restructure with the GM at the top of football operations.
Okay, last thing here is there a compromise here? Do you think they need one? And if you do, what do you think it could look like? Whether it's, hey, Brian Gutekunst, you are now at the top of the org chart, but Matt LaFleur, you have, let's say final say on the 53, something like that.
I think it's an interesting idea because the Seattle Seahawks have done something similar to this, or at least they had it with Pete Carroll and John Schneider. Right. Schneider had final say over the 53, but Carroll had control over the 90, which effectively meant that Carroll had a lot of say over the draft and free agency. But when it came to final cuts, John Schneider was making those calls. Now, I don't think they have to replicate that exactly. If anything, I would say it's probably closer to the reverse, where you let Brian Gutekunst select the full menu and you let LaFleur have a little more influence on what are the selections at dinner, so to speak. But if they're going to do something like that, I think that would make sense, because it is a little awkward to go from, hey, Matt LaFleur, let's say, you had essentially an equal footing with me for your entire tenure here. Now you're technically my subordinate. That would be a way of easing that process if they feel they need to do so.
The only other question, Jason, is if that all happens, how our bit changes. How do we change the final 53 show that we do? Like, do we have to change the personalities a little bit? Like, are we going to have to tweak the format? Because then it gets complicated then.
I think it really comes down to you as Brian Gutekunst and me at Matt LaFleur trying to dictate the other one's hairstyle.
or eyebrow grooming, I think, could also be something that we weave in there. I know that was definitely a bigger part of the first one we did than any of the other ones.
Yeah, I think that part of it died when Aaron Rodgers left Green Bay. But if you want to revive it, by all means. I know you're Aaron Rodgers' #1 fan.
Oh, Jason, a pleasure as always. Thank you so much. Go read the article over on The Leap if you haven't already. We appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot, Peter.
All right, thanks to Jason for joining us on the show today. Always great to talk to him. Back tomorrow with more as we finish out this week. We are now under a month for training camp, which is exciting. This next 4 weeks is going to go by very, very slowly because we're going to be so excited about seeing everyone back on the field. So we're going to do our best to make it entertaining for you. Have some cool guests on, have a lot of fun over the next month as we get ramped up toward football. Follow me on Twitter, Peter_Bukowski. Follow the podcast on Twitter, Locked On Packers. On all of the social medias, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. We got clips coming out. We got fun stuff coming out. We got memes. We got all the good stuff. And over on our YouTube page, all of our episodes are posted. They're on video. So go check that out. Subscribe so you can stay Locked On Packers.